Happy Sabbath. It is good to be, it feels weird to say be here. I'm not sure that makes sense, but to be with you all, at least via Zoom, I have to give you guys a lot of credit. Church plants are hard. They are. They're a lot of work. And one of the things that ties a church plant together is the sense of community, right? And it's really hard to get that over a distance. And so the effort that you guys are putting into this, it'd be easy to say, well, we'll worry about this later. We'll wait till things are normal again. But you guys are doing a marvelous job. Sitting through this service, I have to give you guys a lot of credit for what you're doing and what you're accomplishing here. The sermon title, I generally don't invest a lot of effort into my sermon title. I'm never happy with them. This is one of the rare cases where I actually really like my sermon title. Are we good? Are we good? Now you can go a few different ways. What's he talking about? Of course we're not good, but I'm not asking a philosophical question. The question, are we good, that I'm thinking of is a relationship question. You ever run into have a conflict with somebody and perhaps you apologize and you explain yourself and at the end you say, are we good? Are we good? And you hope that they'll say, yeah, we're good. And perhaps you're on the other side, the one saying, yeah, we're good. This is the are we good that I'm talking about. And more specifically, talking about asking that question to God. I think most all of us really kind of wish that we could ask God that question sometimes. Ask about that relationship. God, are we good? Are we good? Now, I know that we have grace and everything. The tough thing about grace sometimes is we feel like we're not good enough to have it, right? Well, you felt this way before, haven't you? You've wondered, am I actually good enough? No matter how we spin it, grace doesn't come naturally to us. The whole concept is tough for us. We're always looking for that level. Have we reached that level where we're good enough for grace? The Israelites had a whole system that they could work with. They had their whole sacrificial system, and that's great. And for them, they would do their sacrifices, and then once a year they would have the Day of Atonement. Now, Adventists, we should know really well about the Day of Atonement. This is pretty much the holiest day within the Jewish calendar, where in those days they would take two goats. One goat belonged to God, one goat belonged to Azazel in the Hebrew, and there's a question, well, what is Azazel? Generally, we take it to refer to Satan, the devil, and so one goat for each. And God's goat would be killed. The blood of that goat would be used to cleanse the sanctuary. And then after that process was done, the sprinkling process of that blood was done, then the priest would go to the live goat. He'd put his hands on the live goat, the goat that belongs to Azazel, and he would confess all the sins of the Israelites, all those sins that had been building up in God's temple over the year from the other sacrifices. And then they'd send that goat away. That goat would be sent out into the wilderness. Jewish tradition says that as time went on, what they actually did was they pushed the goat off a cliff to make sure it wouldn't wander back into the camp. You can imagine what that would be like if that goat just happened to wander back in. But the idea was get that goat, send him back where he came from, send him back to his owner, with all the sins of the people. And in that sense, their sins were totally gone. And they could say at the end of it, are we good? And they could be absolutely confident that yes, they were good. The ritual really helped them out. They could trust that, yeah, God was saying we're good. there's a story, John chapter 13. We're going to spend all our time here in John. So if you have your Bible, don't worry, I'm not going to be chasing all around on this. We're going to look at John 13, John 14, and then we'll jump to John 21. And that's going to be it. We'll be done at that point. So in John chapter 13, understand this is a sequence that's happening right after Judas has left the upper room to betray Jesus. And so for the next few chapters, well, this really actually is one of the longest parts of John, even though it's just this gap in between Jesus being arrested and Judas leaving the upper room. It's a small window of time, but it takes an enormous part of John. And so we're looking at verse 31 of John 13. We're going to read through to the end. When he had gone out, Jesus said, "Now is the Son of Man glorified, and God is glorified in him. If God is glorified in him, God will also glorify him in himself and glorify him at once. Little children, yet a little while I am with you. You will seek me, and just as I said to the Jews, so now I also say to you, where I am going, you cannot come." Now put yourself in the disciples' shoes. Jesus has just told them, where I am going, you cannot come. And all their ears fixate on that. And as far as I can tell, they totally missed the next two verses. They totally skip past those. Jesus says, "A new commandment I give to you, that you love one another just as I have loved you. You also are to love one another. By this, all people will know that you're my disciples if you have love for one another." Now, again, this is one of the most important things that Jesus is telling them. A little bit later on, Jesus is going to tell them, if you love me, keep my commandments. You know where in John, Jesus specifically calls something a commandment? Here, right here, this command. And so you'd think that perhaps they'd be paying more attention, but no, totally miss it. The first question that comes up, Simon Peter said to him, "Lord, where are you going?" And so now Jesus has to back up. He has to go back and talk about the previous thing, which really isn't as important as this new amazing commandment. Jesus answered him, "Where I'm going, you cannot follow me now, but you will follow me afterward." Peter said to him, "Lord, why can I not follow you now? I will lay down my life for you." Jesus answered, "Will you lay down your life for me? Truly, truly, I say to you, the rooster will not crow till you have denied me 3 times. Now, here's the thing. The disciples may have a vague awareness that things aren't going to go the way that they expected. They may have some vague awareness of this. And Peter here seems to understand that death is going to be involved. And he thinks he's ready to face this. Now, the people reading John, most of them probably understood where the story was going. And you and I, when we hear this, we know exactly where it's going. We know how this plays out. I don't know that Peter realized at that moment. I don't think he fully grasped that he wasn't as strong as he thought he was. And this is the first kind of key point. You don't know yourself. You think you know yourself, but you do not know yourself. I don't know myself, not nearly as well as I think I do. You think you know what you would do, but what would you really do in the moment? Have you ever heard somebody tell a story, about something they did, and someone else listening says, "Oh boy, if that had happened to me, I would have punched him in the face, or I would have really let him have it." And if you're like me, when you heard someone say that, you probably rolled your eyes a little bit, right? Like, yeah, sure you would have. We think we know what we would do. but usually we wouldn't be as bold as we think we are. We like to imagine ourselves being really bold, and it just doesn't play out that way a lot of the time. The reality is, if you haven't experienced it, if you haven't gone through it firsthand, you don't actually know what you would do. This happens sometimes, if you're doing a presentation, something like that. If you think you're ready for it, if you're comfortable, there's no nervousness at all, well, that's a good time to be afraid that you're not prepared enough. Nervousness is actually kind of helpful when you're going to do a sermon, whatever it is, because it helps you make sure that you're fully prepared. It helps you put in all the effort that you need to make sure you're going to do a good job. If you're too casual about it, you take it too easy, you may discover going into it that you're actually grossly underprepared. Now think about this in context of the time of trouble. This is something that Adventists, we talk about a lot, and we spend time wondering, how's this going to play out? What would I do in the time of trouble? And my fear is that if a person goes in believing, saying, you know what, I'm ready for it. I'm ready for it right now. Bring it on. My fear is that perhaps that confidence isn't justified. But perhaps when we're worried about it, when in our head we think, well, I'm a little nervous that I'm not prepared for it. Perhaps that's when we're actually putting the effort into it that we need to be. The thing is, you don't know you. You don't know you at all. You know a little bit, but let's be honest, we're all kind of biased when it comes to ourselves, aren't we? We all think we're a little better than we actually are, perhaps. There's a natural inclination there, but reality, you don't know you. Peter thought he knew himself. He thought he was ready for this moment, and Jesus was absolutely clear with him. But you're not ready for this moment. Not yet. But now, watch where Jesus goes with this. Chapter 14, verse 1. Now, in every Bible, there's a cutoff here. You see, it's the start of chapter 14. You have a new heading. And we read these words that we all know well. We've all heard them before. Jesus says, let not your hearts be troubled. Believe in God, believe also in me. In my Father's house are many rooms. If it were not so, would I have told you that I go to prepare a place for you? And if I go and prepare a place for you, I will come again and will take you to myself, that where I am, you may be also. But the thing is, there's no reason to divide these verses from what just came. This is all part of the same dialogue, the same conversation happening at the same point in time. It's not like they took a break and started over. This break in chapters is entirely artificial. Chapter breaks were added to the Bible long after the manuscripts were written the first time. This is a continual conversation. So when we read, let not your hearts be troubled, Jesus is talking to his disciples after what he has just told Simon Peter. Now put yourself in the disciples' shoes again. You've just heard Jesus tell Simon Peter that he is going to deny Jesus. Not just once, not twice, 3 times. And each one of them is thinking to themselves, whoa, Peter's on the inner circle here. If Peter's going to mess this up, what are we going to do? How's this going to play out for us? And so Jesus steps in. Let not your hearts be troubled. Believe in God, believe also in me. In my Father's house are many rooms. If it were not so, would I have told you I go to prepare a place for you? And if I go and prepare a place for you, I will come again and take you to myself, that where I am, you may be also. You see, here's the thing. You don't know you, but God does. God knows you deeply. And you know what? He loves you anyway. He knew that Peter would betray him. Not betray him, would deny him. Big difference there. He knew Peter would deny him, but he's not that worried about it. Jesus is actually pretty casual with this whole thing. He says, Peter, you are going to mess up big time. But let's talk about the amazing plans I have for you. Now, don't worry about that. Yeah, that's going to happen. Don't worry about it. We've got big plans here. Great things are going to happen. God can say to Peter, look, Peter, you're going to hurt me, and you're going to hurt me deeply. But you know what? We're good. We're good. Those words that we all want to hear from God. Are we good? Yeah. Peter heard them. We're good. This is the story that happens so often in Scripture. God is always there, ready preemptively to reconcile with us. You know the story of David with Bathsheba. David kills somebody over this. He kills somebody. And there he is. God meets him where he's at. Now there's consequences to what David did for sure, but God was there ready to reconcile with David. And then there's Samson. Samson's entire life is a series of screw-ups, time after time after time. And God keeps working with him. God keeps using him. But Samson never fulfills his potential. It's not until the end that he actually really accomplishes what God had for him. And it took Samson making a final mistake and God standing back and saying, okay, face your consequences. And then after some consequences, when Samson says, yeah, I made some bad choices. God, help me out here this one last time. God said, yeah, we're good. Let's do this. And then there's a story of Jacob. I like to preach on Jacob. Jacob is one of my favorite stories because you have this guy whose name means cheater, literally means cheater. He makes these enormous mistakes, gets sent to Laban. And we know about Laban, right? What's Laban? Laban's a cheater. Laban takes advantage of everybody he can, just like Jacob does. And so what does Jacob experience? Jacob experiences what it's like to live with someone who's just like him. I think you could write a TV sitcom about Jacob and Laban and their years together and the antics that they probably pulled on each other, most of which didn't make it into the Bible, because it had to be good. In each case, these people learned from their failures. They became better people. They put aside these massive weaknesses and became the people they were supposed to be. These are the kind of people that God worked through. He didn't work through people that were perfect. He worked through people like David, like Samson, like Jacob. You see, God's focus is not in who you are today. He's not worried about that. Because you know what? He's got that. He's got that worked out. God is concerned with who you can be and who he is turning you into. And so, yeah, Peter wasn't ready that day to follow Jesus. Peter was going to make a big mistake. But you know what? God wasn't worried about it at that moment because Peter was going to grow. Peter was going to become a better person. And that very failure was going to make Peter a better person. You see, today's failures are the things that lead till tomorrow's successes. I don't have that much experience raising kids. Most of you have more experience than I do. I have a 5-year-old, and what? It's funny when I started working, and the first time I had someone that kind of worked under me, I had to learn to trust them to make the right decisions. I had to learn to stand back, not micromanage, just let them do it, and trust they would do a good job. It took me a little time. It was hard, but I got good at that. And I'm actually, perhaps it fits in with my natural laziness. I am happy to give someone else the task and say, I trust your judgment, take care of it. You know what? Having a kid, I have to learn this all over again. And it is really hard this time. I don't know why I can't transfer that skill. It's really hard to just let my 5-year-old make his decision and let him face those consequences. It's tough, but it's an important thing. One of the things about parenting is letting them make mistakes in a safe environment where the results aren't going to be permanent, right? So that they can learn from their mistakes, but they're not going to suffer the consequences of bad choices that, we all made some pretty poor choices when we were teenagers, right? When we were even younger, but we had parents with us that helped ensure that it wouldn't be that bad. Well, we know those failures that our kids make are things that teach them. Natural consequences are the best consequences. And like it is with Peter's failures, with David's failures, Samson's failures, they were big mistakes, but they made these people better people. Sometimes when we fail, when we make our own errors, it's easy to wonder, can God forgive us on this? No matter how many times we've heard about God's grace, we still wonder, well, have I gone too far? Is this a bridge too far? Am I really repentant enough? And for all our worries, God is there saying, you know what, I got this. I'm trusting you. I know how this story is going to play out. I'm going to be a big part of it. You're going to be the person that I want you to be. So worry less about whether or not you're that person now, because you will be. Let's circle back around to what Jesus said, verse 34 and verse 35 of John 13, the part that the disciples completely skip over. Jesus said, a new commandment I give to you, that you love one another, just as I have loved you, you also are to love one another. By this, all people will know that you are my disciples, if you have love for one another. See, this is kind of a big thing here. You don't know yourself, but God does, and he loves you anyway. So if God loves you, despite your failings, we're called to do the same thing. We're called to love each other despite those failings. First off, don't judge others based on what you think you would have done in their shoes. It's not fair. It is not fair at all. I imagine that Peter probably got some ribbing from the other disciples over his mistake. But I suspect it was also restrained because every one of those disciples thought, what if it had been me in his shoes? Would I have made that mistake? Because you don't really know what you would have done. So have compassion, have love for others that have made big mistakes. Because you know what? If you had their background, if you were the person living out their story, you don't know what you would have done. You may have made the same mistake. Love for others matters, no matter their failings. When people wrong you, always be open to reconciliation. Now, in these modern times, I have to add a big caveat to this. I believe in radical forgiveness. And I've stood up in church and preached on radical forgiveness only to discover there was a situation going on in that church where, well, somebody needed to be punished. And there was conflict about whether or not that person should be punished, but it was an abusive person and they needed to be out of that church and immediately. So understand, always open to reconciliation and forgiveness, but that doesn't mean that there's no consequences, all right? There's consequences even when we reconcile. God reconciled with David, but the consequences of his action were lifelong, right? God reconciled with Samson, but Samson could have had a very different story had he not made those mistakes. So please understand, if you've been abused, I'm not expecting you to go back to normal with whoever abused you. That's not how it works. But I would ask you, as much as you can, set aside your anger and bitterness, even if that anger is deserved, and try and set aside those grudges. I've watched people go through a hard time in their life, saw someone whose spouse cheated on them, left them, and I watched them hold on to anger and bitterness for a decade, and it hasn't ended yet. There's no way to live. It's no way to live. If you can't do it on your own, find someone you can talk to. We have to find a way to love others and wish the best for others, no matter the circumstances. Just like God is always ready to say, yeah, we're good. When we bring up that question, when we ask, are we good? We need to be prepared to be those people that say, yeah, we're good. We need to be prepared to love each other, just as God has loved us. He says we're good. Hopefully we can do the same. We can say, yeah, we're good. This story reaches a conclusion in John chapter 21, verse 15. John 21 is kind of an interesting chapter. It seems to be sort of an epilogue. You know, the Gospel of John kind of concludes at the end of chapter 20, but 21 is this epilogue where, various loose ends are tied up, various details are addressed, and right here, Jesus and Peter kind of go back to this. Jesus has just appeared to them, fed them breakfast, some fish at the seashore. It says, when they had finished breakfast, Jesus said to Simon Peter, Simon, son of John, do you love me more than these? There's some question about who these are, whether it's the rest of the disciples or the fish, since Peter was a fisherman. Doesn't matter here. Doesn't matter for our purposes. He said to him, yes, Lord, you know that I love you. He said to him, feed my lambs. He said to him a second time, Simon, son of John, do you love me? He said to him, yes, Lord, you know that I love you. He said to him, tend my sheep. He said to him the third time, Simon, son of John, do you love me? Peter was grieved because he said to him the third time, do you love me? And he said to him, Lord, you know everything. You know that I love you. Jesus said to him, feed my sheep. Truly, truly, I say to you, when you were young, you used to dress yourself and walk wherever you wanted. But when you are old, you will stretch out your hands and another will dress and carry you to where you do not want to go. This he said to show by what kind of death he was to glorify God. After saying this, he said to him, "Follow me." Peter denied Jesus 3 times. And so Jesus confronts Peter and 3 times asks him the same question. Peter, do you love me? And Peter starts out, well, yes, of course. And then it ramps up. Peter, do you love me? Yes, yes. Peter, do you love me? And this time was over the top. Yes, Lord, you know I love you. Why do you keep asking me? And Jesus explains, Peter, your story is going to have a hard end. You're going to die in my service. But that's okay. You're going to be following me. Early on, Jesus told Peter, you're not going to follow me, not now, not this time. Where I'm going, you can't go. You will follow me later, but not now. Peter thought he was ready. Peter thought this was his moment to follow Jesus. And it turns out he was wrong. He wasn't ready for it. But you know that this moment stuck with Peter for his whole life. And when the situation came again, when he was confronted by authorities, when he felt his life was in danger, he was ready. He was ready to keep following. He was ready to keep saying, doesn't matter, I'm a follower of Jesus. I will keep following no matter what. Promises that Peter will be faithful to death, despite the initial failure. And that's exactly how the story played out. Peter was faithful to death and followed Jesus. We make a lot of mistakes. We make a lot of mistakes in our lives. And the thing is, sometimes we feel like these mistakes are pushing us away from God. But when we're followers of God, and believe me, being followers of God does not make you immune to mistakes. We still do it. We worry about it more sometimes, and I'm pretty sure God does, because God has big plans for us. He knows how our story ends, and he's going to be right there every step of the way, from the beginning to the end. He knows us better than we know ourselves, and he knows how to make us better people. And he knows how to do that far better than you and I do. And so he's going to be there walking with us. He's going to send us to the people that make a difference for us and can help with this whole process of salvation. He's going to be a big part of our lives. And when we fail and we feel like we're pushed away, no matter how far away we feel we are from God, God's right there with us, right there, standing beside us, directing our feet. So understand this. When you're working to follow Jesus, despite all those failures, not just the failures in your past, but the failures that are going to happen in the future, you can always look to God, apologize, ask that question, Lord, are we good? And you can be confident. God's saying back to you, yeah, we're good. I'm going to conclude on that thought, and I know there's a benediction, so this isn't the benediction, but I'm going to do a short prayer with you, if that's all right, before we move into the remainder. Gracious Father, give us faith, greater faith to know that you love us. Give us greater faith to know that your grace is always there for us, always happening, always working, as you transform us into the people that you know we can be, Lord. In Jesus' name, amen.